Welcome to the RJLT Economics. Today I want to give a unstructured talk about the politics and the economy of ESG. I want to first make my position very clear, which is that ESG as an aspect of corporate strategy is very important. ESG as a matter of investment policy is idiotic, and I think ESG as part of a political agenda is disastrous. I'm sorry. Now let me explain. First of all, to understand my position, I think it is necessary for me to reiterate my preference. I consider myself to be economically quite conservative, but at the same time, I'm more liberal-leaning or perhaps even left-leaning in social matters, and perhaps in some political matters, but not necessarily. I don't really like a lot of the current liberal politics with regards to the social issues, such as, the gender issues, the marriage issues, all those sort of things. I think those are not those should not be part of the political discussion. However, people want to lead their own lives are their own personal matters, and I don't think that in a free and liberal society, it is up to anyone else to say anything, right? They do whatever they want to do as long as it does not affect other people. And we should not force people to act one way or another. But that's my view, and a lot of people will disagree at this point, because people who are more socially conservative will say that no, we should make sure that there are to emphasize that there are only two genders, and that a marriage is between a man and a woman, and that there are a lot of sexual consensus clearly defined consent of whatever, all those things. But some of the ultra-liberals would say that no, there are numerous or perhaps uncounted number of genders, that it is impossible for us to define what a woman is. And indeed, even if we can define what a woman is and what a man is, it does not mean that the man cannot give birth. All those sort of things. So I think to go too much further down this path is my this podcast is not going to be very fruitful, and indeed a lot of people would disagree. But that's not the point. My point is to say that I'm more of a traditional liberal that perhaps not necessarily exists in the late 20th century in large numbers. So that's where I come from. And I think that ESG as a part of corporate strategy is very important. Why? Because in terms of governance, a company that has very good governance can mitigate a lot of the financial risks. And a company that deals with social issues very well can also resolve a lot of the potential labor-related and community-related troubles. So it's more a matter of risk management, and at the same time, it's also opening up a lot of opportunities, because know for a fact that a lot of people, indeed, as our society develops, as the economy grows, people become more cognizant of the benefits of living in a clean environment, living in a more harmonious society that is safe, and living and working in an environment where where they are treated more fairly. So these values are appreciated by the different stakeholders, and a company that manages these relations with these stakeholders well is a company that fundamentally will be more profitable in the long run. But the same cannot necessarily be said about ESG investment, because yes, I understand ESG investment, and I agree that a good investor, especially of today's day and age, needs to take into account the ESG performance of the target company. Not necessarily because there is a target that's been set by their own investors. And indeed, I think that is exactly the point, the place, or perhaps the bad reason to do ESG investment. Rather, good ESG investment is assessing the ESG performance of the target firm, and understand what are the ESG related advantages and disadvantages that this company may face in the short term, medium term, and long term. A company that has very well ESG practices can indeed innovate better, identify market opportunities better, react better to changes in consumer behavior, to technology, etc., and be more sustainably profitable, and thereby making it a good investment target. But if we only look at the ESG scores made by some synthetic algorithms, these synthetic scores do not reflect the potentials very well. And I think investing based on these ESG scores is really misleading. And although I understand that for a lot of investors, they want to see numbers and they want to have clearly a very simple model that they can punch in a couple of data points and then get a forecast. But that is not necessarily the case, as we take more elements into consideration. In the past, we only take into consideration a forecasting model of profits, given a couple of more simplistic models that forecast the profitability. But now we need to use a more sophisticated model that take into account ESG performance, but nevertheless to forecast the profitability. I think that is the important point. I think that it is the duty, the investors, or perhaps the fund managers, let's say, the fund managers have a fiduciary duty to their investors. They should not be pushed as these social activists, right? The activism, I understand the value of activism, but an activist investor is not necessarily one that is going to do very well. And of course, there are circumstances, special circumstances, where an activist, or perhaps what is it called, a ideologically driven investor can perform well, but it's not suitable for all the funds. But herein lies the problem. A lot of the governments, a lot of the politicians now try to push investors to practice ESG investment. And they do this by changing the rules, regulatory rules, and some of them because they control the pension funds, which are some of the biggest investors in the world, and they are the source of the funding for a lot of the fund managers who actually make direct investments in companies. That is exactly what has been happening. The problem with this is, number one, that ESG investment, the ESG performance is not necessarily easy to assess, and it is not easy to. It's not directly comparable between one company to another company. If we put ESG related performance into a model that forecasts profitability, nevertheless we could make a quite useful model. But if we separate ESG performance and we make ESG a separate item that needs to be that set certain criteria that need to be met for an investment to be permitted, this, I think, is not necessarily going to lead to a very efficient investment. Indeed, I think there will be an increasing misallocation of funds from companies that perhaps have not prioritized embellishing their ESG scores, but not necessarily performing worse in terms of the real ESG aspects. And these companies will lose funding, they will be less competitive, and overall, the economic impact of this politically driven ESG investment, I think, will be slower economic growth, lower or worse living standards, and overall that will mean indeed perhaps a worse result in terms of ESG, because in a wealthier, more productive society, more efforts could be diverted to improve ESG, whereas an economy that is struggling, an economy that needs to prioritize survival, does not necessarily have the freedom or the privilege to allocate sufficient funds and energy towards making good real ESG performance. Then instead, firms will be forced to embellish their ESG scores, and that is where greenwashing comes in. There's greenwashing. Of course, there are these fake social initiatives. There are these a lot of fake communities in order to make the company look that it has good governance practices. But even though, if you ask someone who is working inside the company, you will see a completely different picture. The ESG scores, being a synthetic score, a simple set of numbers, does not reflect these issues. And right, so basically you're optimizing something that is off the mark, and ultimately what you get is worse in investment outcome, worse in economic outcome, and the only ones who are making a killing are the politicians. And so these are the opportunists, right? But one last point I want to make, and I think this is a point that I heard a lot of people make before, and I think perhaps in one of the podcasts today that I listened to, someone made it. I'm not entirely sure who made it, but it was certainly not about ESG. It was about some political topics. But here, I want to make it here again, but about ESG, which is that there are two types of people pushing for an ESG related policy. One, those are the true believers, and 2, those are the opportunists. The opportunists, I think, are the majority of the politicians who see ESG as a vehicle for them to push their political agenda, to strengthen their position, to get more votes, and perhaps to take cuts and perhaps kickbacks from whoever that is going to benefit from it. Perhaps the ESG scoring agencies, perhaps establishment companies who are very good at embellishing ESGs, and they want to force ESG embellishment essentially across the industry, thereby making it very difficult for small and medium-sized competitors to compete at the same level, because investors will be forbidden from investing in these small and medium-sized companies that do not have the money to embellish their ESG performance. They will look worse, even though perhaps the big ones who pay more appear to have better ESG performance. Indeed, all they have is ESG scores. These are the opportunists. But at the same time, the point that I want to make is that, yes, these opportunists, they are somewhat dangerous, but even more dangerous are the true believers. And the true believers, they think that ESG, yes, to have good environment, social governance, those are great ideals. And to get these ideals, it is worthwhile to do whatever they need, even if at the cost of destroying the economy. They do not care about anything for the moment, because they want the economy to perform well in ESG. But the result is somewhat counterproductive, because we need a fast-growing economy, an economy that is very productive, and we want people to automatically, voluntarily commit to improving their environmental, social, and governance practices. If we force them, all we do is, as I said, to cause a misallocation of resources, to cause mismanagement of a lot of the companies, to stifle the competition, and eventually, ironically perhaps, lower a worse environment, social, and governance performance across the economy. All right, that is what I have to say today. I know this is not a very structured talk. It is just a couple of ideas that I have lingering on my mind for over a year now, and especially since the last weekend I talked to one of my, let's say, co-founders in a small service firm that we are building about ESG and data, and clearly that we have slight disagreements in terms of the use of politics in ESG. Now, my view is that ESG, as I said, in corporate strategy is an essential element. In investment, it can be counterproductive, but it's disastrous as a policy. It should not be part of politics. Politicians should not touch these economic issues. The best, again, I want to reiterate, the best thing the politicians and politics of a country can do is to not interfere with people's personal lives, that's on the social side, and not interfere with the activities of private companies, that's on the economic side. There should be certain regulations, but not over-regulation. All right, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening, and visit drjlt.com. Thank you.